Story 1. Francisco Solano Lopez, leader of Paraguay, started a war with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay simultaneously. This conflict was so disastrous that it cost Paraguay 60% of its population and left it with only 28,000 men in the entire country. They lost a quarter of their territory to the victorious nations and created such political instability that in the following 66 years they had 32 presidents, 2 major assassinations, 6 coups, and 8 failed revolutions. Story 2. Gaius Flaminius. Knowing Hannibal was dangerous in the Second Punic War, he ignored the fact that his intelligence said he was outnumbered, and he ignored the fact that his patrols failed to report in during the morning because Hannibal had successfully had them all killed in the night to reposition his army without Flaminius knowing. He then marched his army between a forest and a lake, in heavy fog that stopped him from seeing any approaching enemy, because he assumed Hannibal, who knew his location, was going to stay at camp and just let the Romans assault them. His fellow consul basically begged him not to offer battle that day, but he wanted glory and ordered his army out. So, of course, Hannibal's army just ambushed them from the forest in the fog and drove his army into the lake in a massive slaughter. This was the Battle of Trasimene. Story 3. There was a ranking officer in the United States Civil War who was repeatedly captured and released by the Union forces, Braxton Bragg, for being so incompetent that having him freed and in command was better than risking someone else leading. Essentially, he won a few minor battles early and was promoted way over his competency and was terrible. Story 4. Luigi Cadorna, who led the Italian army to disastrous defeat in World War I, repeatedly sent men into a meat grinder 11 times at Isonzo. Here is a great, very readable summary. Story 5. That airman who was posting military secrets to a Discord server just to win a stupid argument with teenagers and fools. Dude is sitting in prison right now for espionage and treason because he is that mentally challenged. Story 6. The Russian Baltic Fleet versus Japan. Whoever started this, then the admiral that kept going. Just accept a few small failures before you become something taught on what not to do. Story 7. Ala al-Din Muhammad. When Genghis Khan asks you to trade and you respond by killing the messenger and all of the merchants, you are going to have a bad time. Story 8. Not the biggest idiot ever, but I bet most of you never heard of him. Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, commander of the Austro-Hungarian army in the early years of World War I. There was a lot wrong with Austria's army in 1914. It was underfunded, badly equipped, badly trained, and short on artillery, uniforms, and basically everything. The officers were brave but nitwits, and the rank and file were mostly reluctant conscripts from subject peoples and neither trained nor fit. It would take a special kind of man to take this army and turn it into victory. Franz Conrad thought he was that man. Franz Conrad apparently thought he was Napoleon. As it turned out, Franz Conrad was great at making plans but had no idea how to actually command. He decided to try and invade Serbia and Russia at the same time, despite not having the manpower to do either properly. An entire army was sent to the Serbian front. Then when they got there, promptly got told, well, actually, we need you to go to Russia in a bit, so don't unpack. He also didn't bother coordinating plans with the Germans, so while their plans were based on what the Austrians were supposed to be doing, Conrad was cheerfully doing his own thing. Not surprisingly, things went wrong very quickly, and Conrad's big plan was to demand his men keep charging into those Russian and Serbian guns, but harder this time. Not surprisingly, this led to massive casualties which Austria couldn't replace. I forgot to mention that Conrad was one of the loudest voices demanding war in the first place. He knew Austria was in a bad condition, went to war anyway, and made everything so much worse. What a dumbass. Story 9. The Infographics Show or Simple History did a video on this. It was easily that guy in South America who started a war with all his neighbors and got something like 90% of the war-age males and 66% of the general population killed. Story 10. The fort formerly known as Bragg was named after one of the most comically unsuccessful military strategists and well-known poor military leaders in American history. Story 11. Me. During a marksmanship test, I accidentally shot at the wrong target. Got yelled at and made fun of for it. Then on the next round, I did it again. The range instructors could not believe it. No one in military history is dumber than that. I will take my crown now if you do not mind. Story 12. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He set up his own defeat after the fall of the Alamo and the Gallaudet massacre by allowing himself and his soldiers a midday siesta on April 21, 1836. The angry Texans came upon them as they were napping, and the rout was on. Story 13, maybe not the worst by lasting effects, but I think L. Ron Hubbard once fired on a Mexican island because he thought it was a ship or a log he thought was a submarine. He claims he knew what both objects were and it was just target practice, but the island had people on it and he nearly committed an act of war against Mexico. This was after he was already stationed off the coast of California because he was too incompetent to be sent into actual fighting. Story 14. A personal favorite is Leonidas Polk, Confederate general in the Western Theater of the American Civil War. He was a bishop with little to no military experience, but he was friends with President Davis, so he not only got a commission but was protected in command all through the war despite repeated attempts by his superior, the also controversial Braxton Bragg, to get rid of him. His exploits include 1. Sending troops into neutral Kentucky, spurring it to reject the South and call in federal protection. Arguing with his superiors about strategy. Straight up ignoring orders to attack at the Battle of Perryville. Overseeing slow, piecemeal attacks at Stone's River that let his divisions get cut to ribbons one at a time. Feuding with his commanding general, Bragg, and actively trying to get him fired. Ignoring orders to attack before Chickamauga. Ignoring orders to attack at Chickamauga. He was supposed to begin the whole army's attack at dawn on day 2, and never did. According to one account, when Bragg sent someone after several hours to see what the problem was, Polk told the guy he was waiting for breakfast and that he would attack after breakfast. Dying after conferencing with several other generals in an area exposed to Union artillery. One historian described this as one of the worst shots fired for the Union cause in the war. Despite being an insubordinate nepotism hire who was terrible at his job, his men loved him. Story 15. Alfred, Lord Kitchener. He did not like to have his orders to others written down because he did not want his whims of the moment to be contradicted by anything, not even by a piece of paper he had written previously. Story 16. Stalin for decapitating his whole military leadership in the 1936 to 1938 purge, and then giving Hitler permission to start World War II and move his troops eastward in 1939. Story 17. I will put in a bid for Douglas Haig World War I, 425,000 lost at the Somme, 275,000 at Passchendaele, and if I remember correctly, a causative factor in the British Army's moniker for a while thereafter, lions led by donkeys. Story 18. I'm not saying this just because of all the horrible things he did, but because of the mistakes he made. He undermined great military minds, in particular Erwin Rommel, because he wasn't doing things the way Hitler wanted them done, despite having significant successes against the Allies. His most significant mistake was invading Russia, with whom Germany had a non-aggression pact in place, essentially splitting his forces and making the Allied invasion of Normandy inevitable. Story 19. Emperor Caligula made many bizarre decisions during his reign. Certainly, one of them was declaring war on the god of the sea, Neptune. He ordered his soldiers to go to the beach and stab the sea and waves with their swords and throw spears at them. Story 20. Darius, who underestimated Alexander at Issus in 333 BCE. This was followed by the total destruction of the mighty Persian Empire because he thought there was no need to protect Persepolis. I guess this counts as the biggest loss in history. Story 21. Late World War II, Japan decided to just grab that idiot ball and run with it from what I recall. Just making up armies and pretending ships didn't die. No radios on Zero fighter planes, if I recall. Supplies of, here's a bag of rice, get the rest yourself. Just lots of weird social Darwinism and army group infighting. Story 22. George McClellan. Not only was he inept enough to make you think he was trying to lose, but he also had zero self-reflection. He could have ended the American Civil War years sooner and spared many lives, but he refused because he thought the Confederates had more soldiers than him, although everyone else knew it wasn't the case. Later in the war, he ran against Lincoln in the presidential elections, and his victory was probably the only way the Confederacy could have won. Story 23. Antiochus the Great comes to mind. In 2 major battles, his cavalry defeated the opposing cavalry flank, and instead of using that opportunity to flank the enemy infantry, he tried to raid the opposing camp. He lost both battles. The sadder part about the second battle against Rome is that he had Hannibal as a guest in his home but sidelined him due to court jealousies. Hannibal, who is arguably the best ancient battle commander in history and a great user of cavalry. Story 24. Probably a lesser-known man in the West, but a Korean individual named Won-kyun is quite an incompetent fool. Some of you may know Yi Sun-sin, who was Won's predecessor. Won led the very same fleet that Yi used to decisively defeat the Japanese Navy without taking a single loss, and he lost them all in a single disastrous battle. It was so catastrophic that he also died in that battle, and the king of Joseon had to essentially pull Yi out of serving his sentence as a common foot soldier to take action. Any action. The interesting thing is that the greatest victory Yi achieved followed this absolute disaster, at a place called Myeongyang, essentially with the handful of tattered remains of the routed fleet that survived. Story 25. Hitler's decision to invade Russia. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. In my humble opinion, the two biggest screw-ups in military history, both literally changed the future of the world, and they happened in the same war. Remarkable. Story 26. The combined efforts of William Westmoreland and Robert McNamara. McNamara may not have been an idiot, but his statistical approach to the strategy in Vietnam and Westmoreland's adoption of search and destroy tactics was the most foolish way to try to win a war in modern history. Who spends lives taking ground just to succeed and then leave? Story 27. The Soviet commanders during the Battle of Rate Road in the Winter War against Finland. At the time, the Finns did not have a proper defense in the area, allowing the Soviets to easily capture the town of Suomussalmi on the eastern border halfway from the south to the north. This sparsely inhabited region is characterized by dense forests, lakes, and deep snow during winter. The Finns then managed to encircle the Soviet forces in Suomussalmi. To rescue them, the Soviets came up with what they thought was a brilliant plan, sending a heavily armed division of 25,000 soldiers in a large convoy along narrow roads, surrounded by deep, dark forests. However, the Finns used the terrain to their advantage, launching attacks that divided the convoy into smaller pockets, which they then started to destroy one by one until the entire division was annihilated. It simply ceased to exist. This was such a humiliation that Stalin had the commander executed. This battle is still studied in many military academies today as a brilliant example of how a small group of soldiers can inflict significant losses on the enemy by mastering the use of terrain to their advantage. Story 28. I know people respect MacArthur, but his lack of defending the Philippines or the airfields after the Pearl Harbor attack, even though he was warned, and his decision not to attack Japan after Pearl Harbor was a great dereliction of duty. Yes, he had many victories and made good decisions at other times, but I think this mistake was a huge blow to United States morale and gave Japan a greater foothold for their early domination in World War II. Story 29. Would Hitler qualify? He built one of the most powerful militaries and economies in the entire world at the time, but instead of focusing on continued success domestically, he decided to pick a fight with the world out of racism. Story 30. I'm surprised no one said Putin. His 3-day war has been horrific. I would have picked a different location for his pre-invasion buildup. He allowed satellite information to prepare Ukraine. I would have had embedded agents in Ukraine long before repositioning the army. The paratrooper failure is insane. As far as modern warfare goes, he's an idiot. He has his reasons, and not many people understand those reasons. I think people don't understand why he is all in and why this goes nuclear. Russian exit from the Mediterranean has almost been achieved. Maybe this calms down now. My suspicion is that it has been the strategic goal all along. Story 31. Gaius Claudius Glaber was a military commander of the late Roman Republic, holding the office of praetor in 73 BC. During his term, he was defeated in the Battle of Mount Vesuvius against the forces of Spartacus during the Third Servile War. They note his force of Roman militia, not professional legionaries, was destroyed because he was unable to adapt to the gladiators' unorthodox tactics. After Glaber besieged the slaves on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, he failed to anticipate what they would do next. Spartacus' forces used rappelling lines made from local vegetation to scale down the cliffs on the other side of the mountain. They then outflanked Glaber's militia, annihilating his forces. Story 32. Commodore Stephen Decatur Jr. participated in what has to be the dumbest duel in American history, against another Commodore no less. It starts with him asking his best friend to be his second, who tells him, "No, this is highly regarded, don't do it." So he asks someone who could be described as a rival to him, but more accurately is just openly hostile toward and jealous of him. The seconds arranged the details to be 1. Both men start at 8 paces instead of 10. Both men start with guns drawn and aimed. Men can shoot after the count of 2, before the count of 5. Both men hit each other. They both then began apologizing in agony, and they both died.